In 1944, a brave young pilot vanished over the Atlantic Ocean, leaving his family with a lifetime of unanswered questions. For 65 years, his fate remained a mystery. Then, a salvage diver makes a chilling discovery deep beneath the waves. It's not just one plane. It's an entire squadron, resting together on the ocean floor in the exact same place. But as investigators looked closer, they found something that didn't make sense. Evidence showed the planes didn't crash in a storm. They were shot down. And when they searched for the official records of that day, the files were either sealed or had vanished completely. What really happened on that dark night? And was this pilot's disappearance not a tragic accident of war, but a terrible secret someone wanted buried forever? Subscribe. It helps these stories to reach people who lost hope and inspire them to keep seeking truth. And drop your city and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see our map light up. The old house on Sycamore Street breathed with the slow, steady rhythm of the woman who lived inside it. For Eleanor Shaw, now 82 years old, each day was a careful tracing of the one before. The morning sun would slant through the lace curtains at precisely 7 o'clock, illuminating the fine layer of dust that danced in its rays. The grandfather clock in the hall, a wedding gift from a lifetime ago, would chime the hour with a deep, resonant tone that felt less like a marker of time and more like a heartbeat for the silent rooms. Her life had been pared down to these small, predictable comforts. The warmth of tea in her favorite porcelain cup, the familiar weight of a worn quilt on her lap, and the quiet company of ghosts who lived in the silver-framed photographs on her mantelpiece. There was Michael, her beloved husband, gone for a decade now, his smile still so full of life it felt like a betrayal. There were her children, grown and scattered, and her grandchildren, their bright, modern faces a stark contrast to the sepia tones of the past. And then there was David, Lieutenant David Shaw, Michael's younger brother, forever 22, frozen in the crisp uniform of the Army Air Forces, his gaze fixed on a future he would never see. He was the house's deepest silence, the unanswered question that had settled into the very foundation of their family in the winter of 1944 and never left. The government had sent a telegram first, clinical and cruel, missing in action. Then, months later, a second, more final letter, presumed lost at sea. There was no body, no wreckage, no final resting place. He had simply flown into the gray Atlantic sky on a mission over enemy waters and vanished, taking a piece of their world with him. The mail arrived, as it always did, around 10:30. Eleanor watched from her armchair as the familiar blue and white truck stopped at the curb. The postman, a young man with a kind face named Tom, gave his usual wave as he slid the day's offerings through the brass slot in the door. The sound of envelopes and catalogs fluttering onto the worn wooden floor was as much a part of Eleanor's morning as the birdsong outside her window. She waited a few minutes, letting them settle, before rising slowly, her joints protesting with a quiet ache. Bills, a letter from her daughter in California, a handful of glossy advertisements promising to make her life easier, shinier, newer. She sorted through them with practiced indifference until her fingers brushed against something different. It was a large manila envelope, stiff and heavy with age. It wasn't crisp, its corners were softened, its surface bearing the faint smudges and creases of long storage. The return address, typed in a faded, blocky font, made her breath catch in her throat. Department of the Army, Records Administration. Her heart gave a sudden, painful lurch. For years, decades even, an envelope like this would have sent a jolt of desperate hope through her. But that hope had withered long ago, replaced by a quiet, settled grief. Now, it brought only a sense of dread. What could they possibly have to say to her after all this time? Was it a mistake? Some bureaucratic tidying of files? A final notice to inform her that David's case was now permanently archived? A fossil of a forgotten war? Her hand trembled as she carried it back to her chair. For a long moment, she just stared at it, the weight of 65 years pressing down on her. She remembered Michael, in the first years after David was lost, how he would stand at this very window, watching for a postman who might bring news. Every letter, every official-looking envelope, was a potential answer. But the answers never came, and eventually, Michael stopped watching. The silence became their new reality. With a deep, shaky breath, Eleanor slid her finger under the flap. The old paper tore with a dry, rasping sound. Inside was a single, folded sheet of thick, cream-colored paper, bearing an official letterhead. The text was formal, impersonal, filled with the cold language of bureaucracy. It spoke of a recent cataloging initiative, of cross-referencing long-dormant files. She scanned the jargon, her mind struggling to make sense of the sterile phrases. And then she saw it, a line that seemed to burn itself into the page. In connection with the file of Lieutenant David Shaw, service number AO 887-219, we are writing to inform you of a possible new lead. Her vision blurred. She read the sentence again, and then a third time. A possible new lead. The words felt alien, impossible. Below it, the letter continued, explaining that a civilian salvage diving team, operating off the coast of New England, had reported the discovery of submerged aircraft wreckage. Initial assessments, it said, indicated the wreckage was consistent with aircraft from the period and theater of operations in which her brother-in-law had disappeared. The final sentence was a masterpiece of detached procedure. Further information will be made available pending a preliminary investigation. She let the letter fall into her lap. The room was utterly still, but in her ears, a roaring sound had started, like the rush of the ocean. She closed her eyes, and she was no longer an old woman in a quiet house. She was a young bride again, listening to Michael read David's last letter aloud, his voice full of bravado and homesickness. He'd written about the freezing cold, the terrible food, and the fierce loyalty he felt for the men in his squadron. He promised he'd be home by Christmas. He'd promised. A single, hot tear escaped her closed eyelid and traced a path through the fine wrinkles on her cheek. She whispered his name, a sound no one else had heard her utter in years, a ghost of a word. David. Was it possible? After all these years of silence, after they had accepted the void he left behind, could there be an answer waiting at the bottom of the sea? The hope was so terrifying, so fragile, it felt more like pain. It was a door she had locked and barred decades ago, and now, a single piece of paper had just kicked it clean off its hinges. Her granddaughter, Claire, arrived just before noon, her arms full of groceries and her face full of the easy, bustling energy of her 30-something years. She found Eleanor exactly as she'd been for the last hour, sitting motionless in her armchair, the letter clutched in her hand, her teacup cold on the table beside her. "Grandma, are you okay?" Claire asked, her voice instantly softening with concern as she took in the scene. She set the bags down and knelt by the chair, gently touching her grandmother's shoulder. Eleanor didn't seem to register her presence at first. She simply lifted her hand and offered the letter. Claire took it, her brow furrowed with confusion. She read it quickly, her sharp eyes flying across the page. Her initial expression was one of disbelief, a slight shake of her head, as if to dismiss it as some kind of cruel mistake. But as she read it a second time, more slowly, her journalistic instincts took over. The skepticism in her eyes was replaced by a flicker of intense focus, a spark of the fierce determination that Eleanor knew so well. "My God," Claire breathed, looking from the letter to her grandmother's pale face. "Grandma, do you understand what this means?" Eleanor could only nod, the gesture feeling small and inadequate. It meant everything, and it meant nothing. It was a phantom limb, suddenly aching after a lifetime of being gone. "It's probably a mistake," Eleanor said, her voice thin and reedy. "After so long, it can't be. They've made mistakes before." She was protecting herself, throwing up the old, familiar walls of resignation. It was safer there. The silence was a known quantity. This new thing, this sliver of possibility, was a wild and dangerous creature. But Claire would not let her retreat. She took Eleanor's hand, her own strong and warm. "No," she said, her voice firm, cutting through the fog of Eleanor's fear. "We can't assume that. An official letter, Grandma. They wouldn't send this unless they were sure of something. A diving team, wreckage." She stood up and began to pace the small living room, the letter held tight in her fist. Her mind was already racing, connecting dots, forming a plan. The coast of New England, that's where his squadron was based. It fits. We have to find out more. We have to go. Eleanor stared at her, horrified. Go? Claire, I can't. I'm 82 years old. Go where? To do what? To chase a ghost? The idea was overwhelming, a tidal wave of emotion and memory that threatened to pull her under. She felt the familiar sting of grief, but now it was mixed with a raw, terrifying fear. What if they found something? What if they found him? And what if the truth was worse than the mystery they had lived with for so long? He's not a ghost, Claire said softly, stopping in front of her. He was your family. He was Uncle Michael's brother. We owe it to him. We owe it to Grandpa's memory. We can't let this just be another piece of paper in a file. For 65 years, nobody has looked. Now, someone has found something. We have to be there. We have to know. Eleanor looked around the room, at the clock, at the photographs, at the life she had so carefully constructed within these four walls. It was safe here. The world outside was loud and complicated and full of pain, but as she looked into her granddaughter's eyes, she saw not just determination, but a profound sense of duty, a loyalty that bridged generations. She saw the same fire that had been in David's eyes in that old photograph. It was the fire of someone who would not turn away from the truth, no matter how hard it was to face. The quiet of the house no longer felt like peace. It felt like a surrender, a long, slow surrender that had lasted more than half a century. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop. Her trembling hand found Claire's. All right, she whispered, the word feeling both like a defeat and a victory. We'll go. The drive to the coast was a journey through time. As the highways gave way to winding two-lane roads, the landscape shifted from the familiar suburbs to the rugged, salt-scrubbed coastline of New England. The air itself changed, growing heavy and damp, carrying the briny scent of low tide and the distant, mournful cry of gulls. For Eleanor, each mile was a step further back into a past she had tried so hard to leave behind. The gray, choppy waters of the Atlantic, visible now through gaps in the windswept pines, were not just a feature of the scenery. They were a presence, a vast, living entity that had swallowed David whole. She sat silently in the passenger seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the world go by with the detached gaze of someone bracing for impact. Claire drove with a quiet, focused energy, sensing her grandmother's fragility. She didn't fill the silence with meaningless chatter, but the determined set of her jaw spoke volumes. She had made a series of calls, cutting through bureaucratic red tape with a polite but unyielding persistence, and had arranged a meeting with the man who had found the wreckage. His name was Noah Briggs. He wasn't a government official or a treasure hunter, just a local salvage diver who, according to the curt voice on the other end of the line, had stumbled upon something he wasn't supposed to find. They found him in a small, greasy spoon diner at the edge of the town's fishing wharf. The place smelled of stale coffee and fried clams, and its windows were fogged with condensation, blurring the view of the boats bobbing in the harbor. Noah Briggs sat alone in a booth in the back, nursing a thick ceramic mug. He was a man in his early 40s, but the sea had carved deeper lines into his face. His skin was weathered, his hands were thick and calloused, and his eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held the quiet, steady watchfulness of someone who spent more time in the silent world beneath the waves than in the noisy one on land. He didn't look like a hero or a harbinger of truth. He looked like a man who worked hard and kept to himself. When Claire introduced herself and Eleanor, he stood, his movements economical and sure, and shook their hands. His grip was firm, his expression unreadable. He simply nodded and said, "Ma'am, please, sit." Eleanor felt a tremor of anxiety run through her. This was real. This quiet, unassuming man held the key to a 65-year-old secret, and she wasn't sure she was strong enough to hear it. Claire, ever the journalist, got straight to the point after ordering coffee. "Mr. Briggs, the Army Records Office was brief. They said you found something. We'd be grateful if you could tell us exactly what you saw." Noah took a slow sip from his mug, his gaze drifting to the foggy window, as if collecting his thoughts from the gray water outside. "Wasn't looking for history," he began, his voice a low, gravelly hum. "There's a commercial fishing crew, the Odyssey. They snagged their trawl nets on something bad a few weeks back. Tore 'em up good. They hired me to go down, see if I could figure out the obstruction, and maybe salvage the gear. It's a patch of sea most of the old-timers avoid. They say the bottom's littered with junk, old lobster pots, maybe a scuttled boat or two. Bad luck spot. He paused, and Eleanor could picture the scene perfectly. A routine job, a simple task. But fate had other plans. The water's deep out there, Noah continued, his eyes now fixed on the table, as if replaying the memory on its worn Formica surface. Gets dark fast. I was about 120 feet down. Visibility was maybe 20 feet with the lights. I was following the drag marks from the nets, and that's when I saw it. A shape. It wasn't rock. Rock is rounded, worn down. This was straight. A hard, clean line of metal sticking out of the silt. My first thought was, it was a piece of a shipping container, maybe fell off a freighter. He leaned forward slightly, and for the first time, a flicker of the awe he must have felt touched his features. I got closer, and the shape grew. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a wing, an airplane wing, covered in 60-odd years of marine growth. But you could still see the rivets. You could still make out the shape of the star insignia under the grime. Claire was leaning in, her notepad forgotten on the seat beside her. Eleanor felt her own breath catch. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through her carefully constructed defenses. "David's plane," she whispered, the words barely audible. Noah looked at her, and his professional detachment seemed to melt away, replaced by a deep, human empathy. "Ma'am," he said gently. It wasn't just one plane. The diner seemed to fall silent. The clatter of cutlery, the low hum of conversation from the other tables, it all faded away. There was only Noah's voice, painting a picture that was both magnificent and terrifying. I followed the wing to the fuselage. It was mostly buried in the sand, but it was there. A fighter plane, a Thunderbolt, by the looks of it. Sitting there on the seabed, almost perfectly level, like it had just landed. It was eerie, so quiet down there. You feel like you're in a cathedral. And then I swept my light to the left, and my heart just about stopped. About 50 yards away, there was another one. And beyond that, another. They're all down there. 4 of them that I could see. An entire flight, just sitting there. A ghost squadron, resting on the bottom of the ocean. He described the scene with a diver's precision, but his words conjured a haunting, poetic image. The planes weren't a chaotic mess of twisted metal, not the violent debris field of a mid-air collision or a storm-tossed crash. They were arranged in a loose formation, settled into the silt as if waiting for a command that would never come. The glass of the canopies was mostly intact, staring up into the dark water like vacant eyes. Schools of small fish darted in and out of the broken fuselages, the only sign of life in a place defined by death. Eleanor felt a wave of dizziness. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. It was too much. The image was too vivid. She saw David in that cockpit, young and brave, encased in the cold, crushing blackness. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why were they all there? Together? Was it the storm?" Noah shook his head slowly. "That's the thing that doesn't add up," he said, his voice dropping lower, creating a circle of conspiracy around their small table. "I've seen storm wrecks. They're violent. The planes are torn apart, scattered over miles. This was different. It was too orderly. It didn't feel like an accident." He looked from Eleanor to Claire, letting the weight of his words sink in. It felt like they were parked. A cold dread began to seep into Eleanor's bones, chilling her more than the coastal air ever could. She had come here seeking the story of a tragic loss, an act of God, a casualty of war. But Noah's discovery hinted at something else entirely, something calculated, something that had been deliberately hidden beneath the waves. The hope that had surged in her heart just moments before was now transforming into a darker, more complex emotion. Suspicion. A deep, unsettling feeling that David hadn't just been lost. He had been placed there. The question was no longer just what had happened to him, it was why. And as she looked into the diver's steady, serious eyes, she realized that unearthing David's plane might not bring her peace. It might just be the beginning of a whole new war. The town of Port Blossom was not a place for tourists. It clung to the rocky coastline like a stubborn barnacle, its shingles weathered to the color of driftwood, its narrow streets smelling perpetually of low tide and diesel fuel. This was a working town, a place where fortunes were measured in the weight of a day's catch, and history was not written in books but whispered on the wind that whipped off the Atlantic. As Claire navigated their rental car through the town, Eleanor felt as if she had stepped back into 1944. The faces of the fishermen mending nets on the docks were etched with the same stoic resilience she remembered from the war years. These were people who understood the sea's power to both give and take without explanation. They booked a room at the Seafarer's Rest, a small, drafty inn overlooking the harbor. The floorboards creaked with the weight of a century of stories, and the air was thick with the faint scent of wood smoke and damp wool. While Eleanor rested, exhausted by the journey and the emotional weight of their purpose, Claire went to work. She knew that in a town like this, the official channels were only one part of the story. The real truth lived in the collective memory of its people. She started at the front desk, with the inn's proprietor, a woman named Martha whose sharp eyes had seen generations of sailors come and go. When Claire mentioned they were researching a pilot who went missing during the war, Martha's friendly demeanor became guarded. "A lot of boys went missing," she said, her voice flat. "The sea doesn't keep a ledger." But Claire persisted, gently explaining that wreckage had been found, that they had reason to believe it was a specific squadron. She mentioned the name Noah Briggs, and a flicker of recognition crossed Martha's face. "Noah's a good man, quiet. If he says he saw something, he saw it," she conceded. "That patch of water he was diving, we call it the graveyard. My grandfather was a fisherman. He wouldn't take his boat out there for any price. Said the compasses spun and the fish were never right. Said it was haunted." Claire felt a chill, despite the warmth of the small lobby. Haunted by what? Martha leaned on the counter, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Ghost planes, that's the story, anyway. Passed down. Fishermen out in the fog, hearing the drone of old propeller engines where there shouldn't be any. Seeing lights beneath the waves. Most folks dismiss it as foolishness. But in a town this old, you learn not to dismiss everything." The story was repeated, in different forms, down at the docks. An old fisherman, with hands as gnarled as ancient roots, told Claire about his father seeing odd military patrols in the area for months after the war ended, long after the nearby airbase had been decommissioned. They were looking for something, the old man rasped, his eyes on the horizon, or making sure something stayed lost. The whispers and legends created a thick fog of unease, a sense that they were treading on sacred, sorrowful ground. These weren't just stories, they were warnings. They were the scars left on a community that had lived for decades alongside an unspoken secret. It was Martha who finally gave them the lead they needed. "If you want to know what happened on a specific night back then," she said, polishing a glass with a worn cloth, "there's only one person left who might have seen it, Arthur Langford. He was the keeper up at the lighthouse for 50 years. Saw every storm, every ship, every secret this coast ever had. He's an old man now, but his mind, some things, it holds on to like an anchor." Mr. Langford lived in a small, tidy cottage set back from the cliffs, the retired lighthouse still standing sentinel a short walk away. The air inside his home smelled of pipe, tobacco, and old books. He was a frail man, his body bent by age, but his eyes were still sharp, the pale blue of a winter sky. He listened patiently as Claire explained who they were and why they had come, his hands resting on the smooth head of a wooden cane. Eleanor sat beside Claire on a small, uncomfortable sofa, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She felt a surge of hope so powerful it was almost nauseating. This man could be the key. He could be the one person who could finally tell them what happened on the night David's world went dark. 1944, Mr. Langford said, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "A long time ago, a dark time. I remember the convoys, the blackout curtains, the fear. Every night, we'd watch for the U-boats. We're interested in one night in particular," Claire said gently, not wanting to push him too hard. "A stormy night, late in the year. Did you ever see anything unusual? From the light? Any planes in distress?" The old man closed his eyes, The room was silent, save for the ticking of a mantel clock and the distant cry of a gull. For a moment, Eleanor thought he had fallen asleep. But then he spoke, his voice clear and certain, as if he were seeing it all again on the inside of his eyelids. "The storm," he said. "Oh, I remember that storm. One of the worst I ever saw. Wind was screaming like a banshee, rain coming in sideways, so thick you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. It was a bad night to be on the water, a worse night to be in the air." He opened his eyes and looked directly at Eleanor. "There were planes, 4 of them. I saw them in a flash of lightning. They were flying low, too low. They weren't fighting the storm, you see. That's what was so strange. They were circling, in formation, as if they were waiting for something." Hope swelled in Eleanor's chest, a painful, burgeoning thing. This was it. This had to be the night. "Then what happened?" Claire urged, her voice tight with anticipation. "The lights," Mr. Langford said, his gaze becoming distant. "They circled 3 times. I counted. The beams from my lighthouse cut through the rain, and I could just make them out. Then, one of the lights just went out. Poof. Gone. A minute later, another one. Then the third. Then the last one. And then, silence. Just the storm." He looked at them, his old face a mask of confusion that had lasted for over 60 years. There was no explosion, no fire on the water. They just vanished into the dark, one by one. The hope in Eleanor's heart solidified into a terrifying certainty. He had seen it. He had seen David's last moments, but his account only deepened the mystery Noah had uncovered. They didn't crash. They went down deliberately. And in that moment, the sterile, factual account of the lighthouse keeper triggered a memory in Eleanor so vivid and agonizing it stole her breath. She was suddenly back in their tiny 2-room apartment in the winter of 1944. A storm just like this one was rattling the window panes. Michael was home, on a rare 48-hour leave before shipping out himself. He should have been with her, warm and safe in their bed. Instead, he was standing at the window, a dark silhouette against the rain-lashed glass, staring out into the night as if he could somehow see across the entire country, across the vast, churning ocean, to where his brother was flying. He'd been standing there for an hour, barely moving, a bottle of beer untouched on the sill beside him. "Michael, come away from there," she had pleaded. "There's nothing to see. You'll catch your death." He didn't turn. "He's up there right now, Ellie," he'd said, his voice hollow. "Somewhere in this mess. He's up there." She remembered the feeling of utter helplessness, of watching the person she loved more than anything in the world being consumed by a worry so profound it was a physical presence in the room. She had gone to him, wrapped her arms around his waist from behind, and rested her head against his back. She could feel the tension in his shoulders, the rigid set of his muscles. He was fighting a war right there in their living room, a war of hope against a terrible, creeping dread. "He's the best pilot they have," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "Davy knows what he's doing. He'll be all right." But the words were a prayer, not a statement of fact, and they both knew it. They had stood like that for a long time, listening to the wind and the rain, waiting for a brother who would never come home. The memory faded, leaving Eleanor shivering in the warm, stuffy cottage. She was clutching her own hands, her knuckles white. She looked at Mr. Langford, at Claire, at the ticking clock on the mantel. The mystery of the ghost planes was no longer an abstract historical puzzle. It was the storm in her apartment. It was the rigid set of her husband's shoulders. It was the silent, agonizing vigil of a family torn apart by a war that had ended for everyone but them. And for the first time, she felt a flicker of something other than grief or fear. It was a cold, hard ember of anger. Someone had made a decision on that stormy night. Someone had sent those boys circling into the dark, and for 65 years, her family had paid the price in silence. The testimony of the old lighthouse keeper lit a fire under Claire. The whispers and folklore of the town were one thing, but a direct, credible eyewitness account was a solid foundation, a piece of granite in a shifting sea of myth. It transformed their search from a purely emotional quest into a real investigation. With Noah Briggs agreeing to help guide them, his quiet expertise, a steadying presence, They turned their attention from the town's memories to the official record. If a squadron of planes had been ordered to circle in a storm until they fell from the sky, there had to be a paper trail. There had to be an order, a logbook entry, a reason. Their first stop was the local county records office, a musty basement room in the town hall filled with the sweet, decaying scent of old paper. Claire, in her element, moved with a methodical grace, her fingers flying across the keys of a microfilm reader while Eleanor sat patiently, a silent partner in this excavation of the past. But what they found was not clarity, but confusion. The records for the nearby airbase during the last quarter of 1944 were a mess. Pages were missing from flight logs. Weather reports for the night of the storm were oddly vague, contradicting Mr. Langford's vivid account of a hurricane-force gale. Maintenance records for David's squadron were incomplete, with entire sections blacked out by a censor's heavy hand. It was as if someone had deliberately gone through the archives and plucked out the heart of the story, leaving behind a disjointed, nonsensical skeleton. "This isn't just poor record-keeping," Claire muttered, her eyes narrowed in frustration as she stared at another redacted document on the screen. "This is deliberate. Someone scrubbed these files." Eleanor felt a familiar sense of futility creep over her. This was the same stone wall the family had hit 65 years ago. The polite, impenetrable bureaucracy of the military, a system designed to close ranks and protect its own secrets. She had accepted it then, a grieving young woman with no power and no voice. But she was not that same woman anymore. And sitting next to her was a granddaughter who refused to accept silence as an answer. Claire, undeterred, decided to widen the net. They spent the next 2 days driving to the state archives, a sterile, modern facility that felt worlds away from the cozy clutter of the town hall. Here, among endless rows of climate-controlled shelving, they hoped to find duplicate records, communications, logs, anything that might have escaped the local purge. It was Noah who suggested a different approach. "You're looking for the flight records," he said, joining them one afternoon. "But what about the orders that sent them up there in the first place? Those would have come from command, not the local base." It was a critical insight. They shifted their search from the squadron's daily logs to the regional command directives, and that's where they found it, buried deep in a thick binder of teletyped dispatches. So faint, it was barely legible, was a single-line entry. It was a routing order for David's squadron, call sign Wraith, for the night in question. Their original mission, a routine coastal patrol, had been abruptly canceled. A new directive had been issued, timed at 1700 hours. The order was simple and chillingly precise. Wraith Squadron to proceed to Grid Sector X. Ray 7, maintain holding pattern. Await further instructions. Radio silence. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as Claire read the words aloud. Maintain holding pattern. The phrase echoed Mr. Langford's account. They were circling. They weren't lost. They hadn't been blown off course. They were following an order. Grid Sector X-Ray 7, Claire said, her voice tight. She pulled out a nautical chart Noah had given her and spread it on the table. Her finger traced the coordinates. "Look where it is," she whispered, her voice a mixture of awe and horror. The grid sector was a small, unremarkable square of open ocean. Unremarkable, except for one thing. It was the exact location where Noah had found the planes. The discovery was a jolt of electricity. It was the first solid, undeniable piece of evidence that linked David's disappearance to a direct command. They weren't victims of the weather. They were pawns in a plan. But what plan? The log showed no further instructions were ever sent. No recall order. No explanation. They had been sent to a specific spot in the middle of a raging storm and simply abandoned there. The emotional high of the discovery quickly soured, curdling into a dark and terrifying suspicion. This wasn't just negligence. It felt like a betrayal. The institution David had so proudly served, the command he had trusted with his life, had ordered him to his death. Eleanor felt a profound, internal conflict tearing at her. For her entire life, she had believed in the nobility of David's sacrifice. He had been a hero who gave his life for his country, lost in the chaotic fog of war. It was a tragedy, but it was a clean tragedy, one with honor. This new, emerging truth was ugly and stained. It suggested his sacrifice had been meaningless, a cold calculation made by a faceless commander in a warm, dry office far from the storm. The grief she had carried for 65 years was now mixed with a potent, burning rage. Did she really want to know this truth? Was it better to let him rest as a hero lost to fate, or to unearth a story that could tarnish his memory, that could reveal he was a victim, not of the enemy, but of his own side? The thought was a profound betrayal of everything she and Michael had believed. As they packed up for the day, the weight of their discovery settled heavily upon them. They had found a thread, a single, crucial thread, but pulling on it threatened to unravel the entire tapestry of their family's story. That evening, back at the inn, Eleanor stood at the window of their small room, looking out at the dark, churning water of the harbor. The lights of the fishing boats cast long, wavering reflections on the surface. She thought of Michael, standing at a similar window all those years ago. He had been consumed by worry for his brother's safety. But what would he have felt if he had known the truth? That the real danger to David wasn't the storm or the enemy, but the very orders he was sworn to obey. The search for closure had led her to a terrible crossroads. To push forward meant confronting a truth that could shatter the very memory of the man she was trying to honor. But to stop now, to turn back and leave the ghost squadron to their silent vigil at the bottom of the sea, felt like a different kind of betrayal. It meant letting the men who sent them there get away with it forever. The anger won. The quiet, grieving widow was gone. And in her place was a woman who now demanded not just answers, but justice. "We have to find out who gave that order," she said, her voice low and steady as she turned from the window to face Claire. "We have to find his name." The discovery of the directive changed everything. The military, spurred by Claire's relentless inquiries and the undeniable evidence of the log entry, could no longer treat this as a cold case. A formal recovery operation was sanctioned, a slow-moving beast of bureaucracy and logistics that finally lumbered into action. For Eleanor and Claire, the waiting was a unique form of torture, a purgatory of hope and dread. They remained in Port Blossom, their temporary stay at the inn stretching from days into weeks. The town, which had first seemed insular and suspicious, slowly began to embrace them and their story. Their quest for the truth about the ghost planes had become a local cause célèbre, reigniting dormant memories and a shared sense of historical injustice. Noah Briggs became their anchor. He was appointed as a civilian consultant to the Navy's recovery team, his intimate knowledge of the wreck site invaluable. His boat, the Sea Serpent, a sturdy, no-nonsense vessel, became the unofficial headquarters for their vigil. The day the primary recovery ship, a large naval salvage vessel named the USNS Grasp, arrived on the horizon, the entire town seemed to hold its breath. It was a massive, gray machine, bristling with cranes and advanced technology, a stark contrast to the small, weathered fishing boats of the local fleet. It anchored directly over the coordinates of Grid Sector X-Ray 7, a steel monument marking the underwater graveyard. Eleanor and Claire were invited to be present on a support boat, a courtesy extended out of respect for their role in bringing this long-buried secret to light. They watched from 100 yards away as the complex, methodical process began. Remotely operated vehicles, or ROVs, were the first to descend, their powerful lights cutting through the murky green depths, sending back ghostly live feed images to the monitors on the Grasp. The images were grainy, distorted by the water, but they were undeniably real. There was the wing Noah had first described, a hauntingly familiar shape. The fuselage, half swallowed by the sand. The vacant, staring canopy of a cockpit. Eleanor watched the silent, flickering screen, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. Each image was a fresh wound. She was seeing David's tomb, a place she had never been able to picture, now laid bare by the cold, unblinking eye of a machine. It felt like a violation, a desecration of a sacred resting place. Yet, she could not look away. She had to bear witness. She owed him that much. The first days of the operation were focused on mapping the site and assessing the structural integrity of the wrecks. The Navy divers, encased in their heavy gear, moved with a slow, deliberate grace, like astronauts exploring a strange new world. Then, they began the delicate process of recovery. Not the planes themselves. They were too fragile, too deeply embedded in the seabed to be raised whole. But the personal effects, the small human pieces of the story that had been preserved in the cold, oxygen-deprived water for over 6 decades. A call came over the radio to Noah's boat. "We have something," a disembodied voice crackled. "From the lead aircraft. We're bringing it up." Eleanor's hands flew to her mouth. The lead aircraft. David's call sign had been Wraith Leader. It had to be his plane. They watched as a small, sealed container was carefully winched from the depths and transferred to the deck of the Grasp. An hour later, a small launch boat made its way over to them. A young naval officer, his face grim and respectful, stepped aboard. He carried a waterproof case. "Ma'am," he said to Eleanor, his voice soft, "we believe these belong to Lieutenant Shaw." He opened the case. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft foam, were 3 objects, dark and encrusted with the residue of the sea. The first was a set of dog tags, rusted but still legible. D.M. Shaw. The letters were a punch to the gut. The second was a waterlogged flight manual, its pages fused into a solid, indecipherable brick. And the third made Eleanor gasp, a sound of pure, unadulterated anguish. It was a pocket watch. A silver hunter case watch with the initials D.S. elegantly engraved on the cover. She didn't need to see the inscription. She knew that watch. She had been there the day Michael gave it to him, a week before he shipped out. It was a family heirloom, passed down from their grandfather. "So you're never late coming home," Michael had joked, clapping his younger brother on the shoulder. David had looked so proud, so impossibly young, as he tucked it into the pocket of his new uniform. With trembling fingers, Eleanor reached out and touched the cold, wet metal. It was real. After 65 years of having nothing, no grave, no letters, no final words, she was holding something that David had held, something that had been with him in his final moments. She lifted it, the weight of it both a comfort and an unbearable burden, and clutched it to her chest. The tears she had held back for so long finally came, not in a gentle stream, but in a gut-wrenching, soul-deep sob that shook her entire body. Claire wrapped her arms around her grandmother, holding her tight, her own tears falling silent. It was a moment of profound, heartbreaking connection, a bridge of grief and love that spanned the immense gulf of time. This should have been the peak of their emotional journey. They had found him. They had brought a piece of him home. It should have been the beginning of closure. But later that day, as the divers continued their methodical work, a new, more disturbing discovery was made. The initial assessment that the planes had been shot down, a theory whispered among the recovery team, was suddenly confirmed with chilling evidence. An ROV, examining the fuselage of the second aircraft in the formation, focused its camera on a series of jagged, symmetrical holes punched through the metal skin just behind the cockpit. These weren't stress fractures from a crash. They weren't the result of corrosion. They were bullet holes. Large caliber rounds, consistent with the guns of a fighter plane. Another plane, examined an hour later, showed similar damage to its tail section. A third had a shattered canopy, not from impact with the water, but from something that had ripped through it from above. The news spread from the Grasp to Noah's boat in a hushed, horrified radio call. They hadn't just been ordered to circle in a storm until their fuel ran out. They had been attacked, shot down. The mystery deepened into something far more sinister. Who had attacked them? There were no records of enemy aircraft in that sector on that night. The German U-boats had no air cover that far out. And if it had been friendly fire, a tragic accident, why the cover-up? Why scrub the records? Why leave an entire squadron of America's finest to be forgotten at the bottom of the ocean? The elation Eleanor had felt just hours before, clutching David's watch, evaporated, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. The image of the planes resting peacefully on the seabed was a lie. The scene had not been peaceful. It had been a slaughter. David and his men hadn't just been abandoned. They had been executed, picked off, one by one, in the heart of a storm. Their final moments not of quiet resignation, but of terror and violence. The pocket watch in her hand suddenly felt different. It was no longer just a symbol of connection and memory. It was the possession of a murder victim. And the question that now burned in her mind was not just who had given the order to send them there, But who had pulled the trigger? The discovery of the bullet holes sent a shockwave through the entire operation. This was no longer a recovery mission. It was a crime scene investigation, 65 years cold. The atmosphere on the boats, once a mixture of solemn respect and historical curiosity, became thick with tension and a grim sense of purpose. For Eleanor, the revelation was a profound violation. The clean, honorable narrative of her brother-in-law's sacrifice had been systematically dismantled, piece by painful piece. First, the heroic accident was revealed to be a direct order. Now, the quiet, dignified end in the heart of a storm was revealed to be a violent, terrifying execution. The image of David, alone in his cockpit, circling in the rain, was replaced by a new, horrific vision. David being hunted, his plane torn apart by gunfire from an unseen enemy. Who could have done this? And why would the military, their own military, go to such extraordinary lengths to bury the truth? It was a question that consumed Claire. Her journalistic instincts, honed by years of digging into corporate and political malfeasance, kicked into overdrive. While the Navy focused on the physical evidence at the bottom of the sea, Claire began a new, frantic search through the archives, this time looking for something far more specific than a missing flight log. She was looking for a ghost. If 4 planes from Wraith Squadron were at the bottom of the ocean, where was the rest of the squadron? Personnel records showed that David's unit was comprised of 12 aircraft. Where were the other 8 pilots? Were they all lost? Or had some of them survived? She spent days hunched over personnel files, cross-referencing names, service dates, and discharge papers. It was a painstaking, needle-in-a-haystack search, but Claire was relentless. She found that most of the other pilots from the squadron had completed their tours of duty and returned home, their records clean and unremarkable. But 2 of them stood out. Their files were odd. Both pilots had been granted honorable discharges just weeks after the incident, citing combat fatigue. It was an unusually swift and clean exit from the service in the middle of a war. One of them, a Captain Robert Miller, had died in a car accident in 1951. The other, a lieutenant named Frank Jensen, was a ghost. His trail went cold after his discharge. There was no address, no family, no record of him anywhere, except for one small, tantalizing clue. In his out-processing paperwork, there was a handwritten note in the margin, barely legible, mentioning an uncle in rural Vermont. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble based on a 65-year-old scribble, but it was all they had, leaving Eleanor in the care of Martha at the inn, with Noah promising to keep her updated on the recovery. Claire drove the 6 hours inland, into the rolling green hills of Vermont. She found the name Jensen in a small town's phone book. An old woman answered, her voice frail. She was Frank Jensen's niece. She told Claire that her uncle had passed away almost 20 years ago. Claire's heart sank. Another dead end. But then the woman added something that made Claire's pulse quicken. He never talked about the war, the niece said. Never. But he left behind some things. Old boxes in the attic. My husband keeps meaning to clear them out. There are some old reel-to-reel tapes. I think he was trying to write a book once, telling his story. He never finished. An hour later, Claire was sitting in a dusty, sun-drenched attic, a vintage tape recorder balanced on her lap. The niece had given her permission to listen. With a click and a whir, the old machine came to life. And then, a voice, raspy with age and emotion, filled the silent attic. It was Frank Jensen. He was telling his story. The tape was a confession, a final, desperate attempt to unburden a soul that had carried an impossible secret for 40 years. He described the night of the storm, his voice trembling as he recalled the howling wind and the blinding rain. He confirmed they were under direct orders from their commander to hold their position over grid sector X-ray 7. And then he described the betrayal. We were bait. Jensen's voice crackled from the speakers, the words heavy with a lifetime of shame. Just sitting ducks. Commander Harris told us it was a top-secret rendezvous, that we were to provide air cover for a friendly vessel. It was a lie. There was no vessel. He explained that their squadron had been sent out in 3 flights of 4. David's flight was the lead element. Jensen's was the second, flying a few miles behind, with the 3rd flight held in reserve back at the base. They were all under strict radio silence. We saw them before we heard them, Jensen continued, his voice dropping to a choked whisper. 2 of them, unmarked planes. They came out of the clouds from above, like wolves. They weren't German. They were ours. P-51s, the best we had. They just opened up on David's flight. No warning, no radio chatter, just streams of tracer fire cutting through the rain. It was a massacre. We watched them pick our friends apart, one by one. Claire sat frozen, the tape recorder clutched in her hands. This was it, the horrifying, unthinkable truth. It wasn't the enemy. It wasn't friendly fire. It was a deliberate, cold-blooded execution by their own side. Jensen's voice cracked with emotion as he described the terror and confusion in his own cockpit. He and his flight leader knew they were next. They broke radio silence, screaming for orders, for an explanation. The only reply they got was from Commander Harris himself, his voice cold and steady over the radio. Return to base. Your mission is complete. You will speak of this to no one, ever. The villain finally had a name, Commander Harris, a man who had used his own pilots as a sacrifice. But why? Jensen's confession provided the final, sickening piece of the puzzle. It was a trap, not for the planes, but for a German U-boat. Intelligence believed a high-value submarine, a milch cow resupply sub, would be surfacing in that sector to meet a contact. Harris, a ruthless, ambitious officer obsessed with promotion, concocted a depraved plan. He would sacrifice a flight of his own planes, making it look like a tragic accident in the storm. The ensuing search and rescue operation would provide the perfect cover for a massive anti-submarine force to converge on the area and destroy the U-boat. He had traded the lives of 4 of his men for a chance at glory. He had murdered them for a medal. The tape ended with a long, shuddering sigh from the old pilot, the sound of a man who had finally let go of a burden too heavy to carry. When Claire returned to Port Blossom that night, she found Eleanor sitting by the harbor, David's pocket watch held loosely in her hands. The setting sun cast a golden glow on the water, a stark contrast to the darkness that now filled their world. Claire didn't need to say much. She simply sat beside her grandmother and played the tape. Eleanor listened without a word, her expression unreadable, her gaze fixed on the endless, unforgiving sea. The sound of Frank Jensen's voice, the raw pain of his confession, filled the salt-laced air. When it was over, there was only the sound of the waves lapping against the shore. Eleanor did not cry. Her grief had been burned away, leaving behind something harder, colder. She looked at the pocket watch, then at her granddaughter's face, her eyes blazing with a righteous fury that defied her 82 years. Her brother-in-law had not been lost to fate. He had not been a casualty of war. He had been betrayed, murdered by the very institution he had sworn to serve. His life discarded like a spent shell casing by a vain, cruel man. The story of David Shaw was no longer a tragedy. It was an atrocity, and Eleanor knew, with every fiber of her being, that she could not rest until the world knew the name of the man who had sent him into the storm. The confession on Frank Jensen's tape was a bombshell, but it was also the word of a dead man. Claire knew that to make the story stick, to force the military to acknowledge the atrocity, they needed more than a ghost's testimony. They needed physical proof. The focus of the recovery mission shifted. Armed with the new information, the divers were now looking for specific evidence of the ambush, bullet casings, fragments from the attacking planes, and most importantly, the sealed orders that might still be locked away in one of the cockpits. As the operation entered its 3rd week, the weather, which had been unnervingly calm, began to turn. A storm system was brewing offshore, a dark smudge on the horizon that grew larger and more menacing with each passing hour. The locals watched the sky with a practiced unease, recognizing the signs. The gulls flew inland, the air grew thick and heavy, and the sea, which had been a calm, rolling blue, turned a sullen, slate gray, its surface choppy and agitated. The forecast was grim. A nor'easter, a powerful coastal storm, was bearing down on them, with winds and swells that would make the salvage operation impossible and dangerous. The commander of the USNS Grasp made the call. They had 24 hours to secure the site and get their ships back to the safety of the harbor. The news sent a wave of panic through Eleanor. It felt like a cruel cosmic joke, history repeating itself. Another storm, just like the one that had claimed David, was now threatening to swallow the truth forever. The pressure on the divers was immense. They worked around the clock, in increasingly difficult conditions, a frantic race against the approaching tempest. Noah, on his boat, was a blur of motion, coordinating with the Navy divers, his face etched with a grim determination. He knew these waters better than anyone, and he knew what a storm like this could do. It could shift the seabed, burying the wrecks under tons of sand, undoing all their work, and silencing the ghosts of Wraith Squadron for good. On the final afternoon, with the wind beginning to howl and the first stinging drops of rain lashing down, a diver made a breakthrough. Inside the cockpit of the fourth plane, tucked away in a small, waterproof document canister, he found it. A sealed tube containing the squadron's final, revised orders. It was the smoking gun. But as the diver began his ascent, a rogue wave, a monstrous swell born of the building storm, slammed into the side of the Grasp. The ship lurched violently, and a heavy piece of rigging, a thick steel cable, snapped from its mooring. It whipped across the deck with incredible force, snagging the diver's umbilical line, his lifeline, providing air and communications. The line was severed. The diver, his air supply cut off, was instantly in mortal danger. Trapped 100 feet below in the churning, darkening water, a frantic alarm sounded across the ship. Diver down, diver down. The organized chaos of the recovery operation dissolved into a desperate rescue mission. On his boat, Noah heard the call and didn't hesitate. He was already pulling on his own gear. "I'm going in," he yelled to his crewmen over the rising wind. "He's got minutes, if that." From the bridge of the support vessel, Claire and Eleanor watched in horror. The sea was a maelstrom, waves crashing over the deck, the small boats bucking and pitching like toys. They saw Noah, a small, dark figure against the raging sea, dive into the violent water. For Eleanor, the scene was a waking nightmare. She was paralyzed, watching another brave man disappear beneath the waves, swallowed by the same indifferent, angry ocean that had taken David. The helplessness was suffocating, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. She clutched the railing, the cold, wet metal biting into her hands, her knuckles white. She whispered a prayer, the words lost in the shriek of the wind, a desperate plea to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. Down below, Noah fought against the violent currents. The visibility was almost zero, the water a swirling chaos of sand and debris. He followed the useless, severed umbilical line down, his powerful dive light cutting a weak, lonely beam through the gloom. He found the stranded diver near the wreckage of David's plane, his body limp, his emergency air supply already exhausted. The man was unconscious. With a strength born of adrenaline and years of experience, Noah managed to get his own emergency regulator into the man's mouth, forcing life-giving air into his lungs. He then began the slow, agonizing ascent, fighting the storm's pull, dragging the dead weight of the other diver with him. On the surface, the minutes stretched into an eternity. The crew of the Grasp waited, their faces pale and grim, their eyes scanning the violent waves. Claire stood beside her grandmother, a comforting arm around her shoulders, though she herself was trembling. This was the moment of truth, the emotional precipice. Had they come all this way, uncovered this terrible secret, only to watch another life be lost in the same patch of sea? And then, a shape broke the surface. Two shapes. Noah, his face, a mask of exhaustion, holding the unconscious diver in a rescue grip. A cheer went up from the ships, a raw, ragged sound of pure relief that was almost instantly torn away by the wind. A rescue line was thrown, and sailors hauled the two men aboard the Grasp. The rescued diver was alive. As the medical team rushed to work, Noah, shivering and spent, looked across the water and met Eleanor's gaze. In that moment, a profound, unspoken understanding passed between them. He had risked his life, not just for another diver, but for her, for David, for the truth. That night, as the storm raged outside, battering the coast with its full fury, the small group gathered in the inn's common room. The rescued diver was stable. The sealed orders were safe. They had won. But the victory felt hollow, overshadowed by the raw, terrifying brush with death they had all just witnessed. Eleanor sat by the fire, David's silver watch resting in her palm. The storm outside was no longer just weather. It was a living, breathing entity, an echo of the past, a symbol of the violence and chaos that had defined this story from the very beginning. She felt the full, crushing weight of her decision. In her pursuit of the truth, she had put others in harm's way. Noah could have died. The other diver could have died. Was the truth worth that price? Was her need for justice, for vengeance against a dead commander, worth the life of a living man? The question plunged her into a deep emotional valley. The fiery anger that had sustained her was gone, replaced by a cold, aching doubt. She had set this chain of events in motion with that first, fateful decision to leave the safety of her quiet home. Now, looking at the exhausted faces of Claire and Noah, seeing the true cost of her quest, she felt a terrible sense of responsibility. Was she honoring David's memory? Or was she simply creating new ghosts to haunt this already sorrowful coast? The storm had broken, but the emotional tempest inside her was just beginning. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and glistening under a pale morning sun. The air was cool and crisp, and the sea, though still unsettled, had lost its violent anger. But the emotional turmoil in the hearts of those who had weathered it was not so easily calmed. The sealed document tube, recovered at such a high cost, was the talk of the entire operation. It was flown by helicopter to a secure naval facility for analysis, and the wait for its contents to be revealed was an agony of suspense. For 2 days, an official silence descended. Claire, frustrated by the lack of information, worked her sources relentlessly, but the military had locked down the investigation. The stakes were too high now. This was no longer just about a forgotten squadron. It was about a potential war crime, covered up at the highest levels. The truth, when it finally came, did not arrive in an official press release or a formal briefing. It came in the form of a quiet, unscheduled visit from a Navy captain, a man named Evans, the lead investigator assigned to the case. He was a tall man with a serious, careworn face, and he met with Eleanor, Claire, and Noah in the private dining room of the inn. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He placed a folder on the table between them and opened it. Inside were high-resolution photographs of the documents that had been sealed in the tube for 65 years. The paper was remarkably well preserved. The ink was faded but perfectly clear, and the words they formed were a final, damning indictment of Commander Harris. The orders were exactly as Frank Jensen had described in his taped confession. They detailed a decoy operation, codenamed Shepherd, designed to lure an enemy submarine to the surface. Wraith Squadron, specifically David's flight, was designated as the sacrificial element. The documents were cold, clinical, and utterly monstrous. They spoke of the pilots not as men, but as assets to be expended. One line, in particular, made Eleanor's blood run cold. It was a handwritten addendum at the bottom of the typed page, initialed by Harris himself. Expendability of Shepherd element is considered an acceptable operational loss. An acceptable loss. 4 young men, including her David, their lives, their futures, their family's grief, all reduced to a sterile, tactical calculation. But the tube contained something else, something even more shocking. Tucked behind the official orders was a second, folded piece of paper. It was a personal note, written in a different hand, its script hurried and almost frantic. It was from the squadron's intelligence officer, a young lieutenant who, it was later discovered, had died in a training accident just a month after the incident. "They're not coming for us," the note read. "Harris is sending the Mustangs. This is a death sentence. God forgive us." It was the final, irrefutable proof. Not only had Harris planned the sacrifice, but the pilots of the attacking P-51 Mustangs, the executioners, had likely been lied to as well, told they were firing on enemy aircraft or defectors. The cover-up was total, a web of deceit that had ensnared everyone involved. The room was silent as Captain Evans finished his explanation. The cold, hard evidence on the table was a tombstone, marking the grave of a lie that had survived for more than half a century. The truth had finally resurfaced. The news of the discovery could not be contained. Claire, using the confirmed documents and a carefully edited portion of Jensen's tape, wrote an article that was picked up by a national newswire. The story of the Ghost Squadron of Port Blossom exploded. It was a tale of heroism, betrayal, and a decades-long search for justice that captivated the nation. The town of Port Blossom, once a forgotten backwater, was suddenly at the center of a media storm. News vans lined the narrow streets, and reporters swarmed the docks, all seeking a piece of the story. But the town, fiercely protective of Eleanor and the sanctity of the mission, closed ranks. They directed the media to official channels, their quiet, steadfast loyalty a shield against the intrusive glare of the spotlight. In the wake of the revelation, something remarkable began to happen. Families of the other 3 lost pilots from David's flight, who had lived for 65 years with the same empty silence as the Shaws, began to come forward. An elderly woman from Ohio, the younger sister of David's co-pilot, a man from Florida, the grandson of the squadron's navigator. They traveled to Port Blossom, drawn by the incredible news, their hearts full of a mixture of ancient grief and newfound hope. The town embraced them. Martha opened up rooms at the inn, refusing any payment. The fishermen shared their stories, and Mr. Langford, the old lighthouse keeper, held court in his small cottage, retelling his account of that stormy night to a new, deeply invested audience. A memorial service was organized. It was held on the cliffs overlooking the sea, not far from the lighthouse. It wasn't a military ceremony, but a town ceremony. It was for David, and for Robert, and for Charlie, and for Jimmy, the 4 boys of Wraith Leader's flight. Hundreds of people gathered, townspeople, the newly found families, the Navy recovery crew, all standing together under a vast, clear blue sky. Eleanor, who had felt so lost and adrift in her sea of doubt just days before, now stood before them all. She was no longer just a grieving widow. She was a witness, a keeper of the truth. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It was steady and clear, carried on the gentle sea breeze. She didn't speak of betrayal or anger. She spoke of memory. She spoke of the young, vibrant men who had been sacrificed. She told the story of David's pocket watch, of her husband Michael waiting by the window, of the love and loyalty that had refused to let their memory die. She honored not just the 4 pilots, but every family who had ever been given a folded flag and an empty explanation. As the service concluded, Noah Briggs approached Eleanor. His face was serious, but there was a new light in his eyes. "We found something else," he said quietly, so only she and Claire could hear. "While we were securing the site, the sonar picked up another anomaly. A larger sonar contact, deeper and about a quarter-mile north of the plains. It's big, very big. The initial readings, they're consistent with a World War II-era submarine." Eleanor and Claire stared at him, stunned into silence. Commander Harris's plan had worked. The U-boat he had been hunting, the prize for which he had sacrificed his own men, was down there too. The final piece of the story, the tomb of the enemy that had cost them so much, was lying in the dark, waiting. The discovery was a final, stunning twist. The official investigation was over, but the full story of that night was not. This was not the end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. In the weeks that followed the memorial service, a quiet but profound transformation took place in Port Blossom. The town, once defined by its insular nature and its quiet acceptance of old ghosts, had become a place of pilgrimage, a center for remembrance. The story of Wraith Squadron had given a voice to a generation of families who had borne their losses in silence, and the shared act of bringing the truth to light had forged a powerful, unbreakable bond between them all. The Navy, in an unprecedented move of transparency and reconciliation, worked with the town to establish a small, permanent memorial museum. It wasn't a grand, sterile institution, but a simple, heartfelt space housed in the old cannery building on the wharf. Its centerpiece was a large, salvaged piece of fuselage from one of the recovered planes, its riveted aluminum skin bearing the scars of the sea and the violence of its final moments. Displays were filled with photographs of the 4 young pilots, copies of their letters home, and the artifacts that had been brought up from the deep. It was a place of sorrow, but also of profound honor. On the day the museum officially opened, Eleanor Shaw walked through its quiet halls, her steps slow and deliberate. She had come not as a grieving relative, but as the matriarch of a story that now belonged to the world. She stopped in front of the main display case, where David's dog tags and his waterlogged flight manual were carefully arranged. Beside them was a small, empty velvet cushion. She reached into her pocket and took out the silver pocket watch. During her time in Port Blossom, she had taken it to a local craftsman, an old clockmaker with gentle, patient hands. He had painstakingly disassembled the salt-corroded mechanism, cleaned each tiny gear and spring, and, miraculously, brought it back to life. Now, for the first time in 65 years, the watch was ticking. The sound was soft, steady, a tiny, persistent heartbeat in the quiet room. It was the sound of a life, interrupted but not extinguished. With a steady hand, Eleanor opened the glass case and placed the watch on the velvet cushion. She didn't want it in her pocket anymore. It didn't belong to her grief. It belonged here, with David, a testament to the time that had been lost and the truth that had finally been found. The ticking, she thought, was not a counting down, but a counting on, a promise that his story would now continue, that it would never be silenced again. Claire stood beside her, a hand on her grandmother's shoulder. The journey had changed her, too. The fierce, almost reckless drive for the story had been tempered by a deeper understanding of the human cost of truth. She had started this as an investigation, a puzzle to be solved. She was ending it with a profound sense of purpose. She had seen how one story, brought into the light, could heal decades of unspoken pain, how it could connect strangers across generations and forge a community from shared loss. She told Eleanor that she wasn't going back to her old job. She was going to stay on the coast for a while, working with the families of other pilots listed as missing, non-combat during the war. David's story, she now realized, was not an anomaly. It was a single, heartbreaking chapter in a much larger, unwritten book of secrets and sacrifices. Noah's discovery of the sunken submarine had opened a new, complex investigation, one that would be handled by international authorities. But Claire's work was here, with the human stories, with the families still waiting for their own Eleanors to ask the questions no one else would. She was no longer just a journalist chasing a headline. She was a custodian of memory, carrying the torch that her grandmother had so bravely lit. That evening, their last in Port Blossom, Eleanor walked alone to the cliffs overlooking the sea. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. The water was calm, a vast, breathing expanse of silver and gold. The anger she had felt, the burning rage against Commander Harris and the institution that had protected him, had finally cooled. It hadn't vanished, but it had settled, transformed into a deep, quiet resolve. Justice, she now understood, was not always about punishment. Commander Harris had died an old man, decorated and celebrated, his crimes buried with him. There would be no court-martial, no public disgrace. But his victory had been a hollow one. He had died with his lie, but the truth had outlived him. And in the end, that was a more powerful victory. The truth had resurfaced, and it had brought with it not vengeance, but healing. It had brought families together. It had given honor back to the dishonored. It had turned a place of haunting into a place of remembrance. She stood there for a long time, the gentle sea breeze on her face, listening to the rhythmic sigh of the waves against the shore. She thought of Michael, and how this knowledge would have both broken his heart and healed it. He had died never knowing what had become of his brother, carrying that open wound for his entire life. But now, she knew for him. She could finally close that chapter. She held no physical memento of David any longer. The watch was where it belonged. But she carried him with her, no longer as a question or a void, but as a complete story, a life with a beginning, a middle, and now, a final, honorable end. A quiet awe settled over her, a sense of peace that had eluded her for most of her life. The world was still full of secrets and sorrows. But here, on this cliff, in this small town that had embraced her family's pain as its own, a great and terrible wrong had been made right. The silence had been broken. The ghosts had been heard. And as the last sliver of the sun disappeared below the horizon, Eleanor Shaw looked out at the darkening water and whispered the words she had longed to say for 65 years. You were never forgotten, David. And now, you never will be.